In this episode of the Stories to Sleep To, you will listen to The Last Night of the Jaguar Priest. Section 1. The Temple at Dusk. Stone, Vines, and Breath. The temple rested in the jungle the way an old animal rests, without effort, without thought, held upright by habit and time rather than strength. Its stones, once pale and sharply cut, had softened into darker shades of green and brown, furred with moss and traced by the wandering fingers of vines. Roots pressed patiently into the seams between blocks, not forcing, only waiting. Everything here understood the virtue of waiting. As the sun lowered itself toward the distant line of ceiba and mahogany trees, the light thinned and lengthened. It moved across the temple steps like water poured slowly from a vessel, catching on carved edges, settling into shallow depressions where glyphs still lingered. The carvings no longer spoke clearly to the eye, but they were not silent. They breathed memory into the evening air. The priest stood near the temple's upper doorway, his bare feet planted against stone warmed by the day. He did not hurry. He had not hurried for many years now. His body had taught him that the jungle did not reward haste, and neither did the gods. Movements made too quickly disturbed the air, startled the unseen, broke the fragile agreement between breath and world. His back bent slightly forward, not from weakness, but from habit, as though he had spent a lifetime listening closely to the ground. His hair, once bound tightly and darkened with ritual oils, now fell thin and silver against his shoulders. The lines in his face had softened rather than sharpened, worn smooth by repetition of expression, patience, attention, restraint. He wore no elaborate regalia now. The jaguar skins and feathered mantles of ceremony had been laid away earlier in the day, folded carefully, brushed clean of incense ash. Tonight required no display. Tonight required presence. Inside the temple chamber behind him, the air was cooler. Stone walls held the memory of night even while the jungle outside still clung to the last warmth of day. The priest had prepared the space slowly, as he always did. He had swept the floor with bundled reeds, not to remove dirt, there would always be dirt, but to signal intention. He had arranged small bowls of copal resin, cacao, and maize kernels along the altar's edge. Each placement had been deliberate, familiar, almost automatic, yet not careless. Repetition did not dull meaning, it refined it. A thin ribbon of smoke drifted upward from the copal, pale and sweet. It rose, wavered, then disappeared into the darker air near the ceiling stones. Smoke was a language the gods still listened to, even when words failed. Beyond the temple, the jungle adjusted itself for night. Cicadas began their layered rhythms, testing patterns before committing to them. Birds made their final calls, brief and practical. Somewhere deeper within the green density, something heavier shifted. Perhaps a tapir moving toward water, perhaps nothing at all. The jungle never explained itself, and the priest had long ago learned not to ask it to. He inhaled slowly, feeling the air fill his chest, then released it just as slowly. Breath was the first ritual, the one that framed others. With each exhale, he felt the day loosen its grip on his bones. This would be his final night here, not because the temple would fall, or because enemies approached, or because the gods had demanded some dramatic end. It was simply time. The calendars he had studied since youth did not shout their conclusions, they whispered them, repeating the same quiet truths until they could no longer be ignored. Cycles closed as gently as they opened. He had known this night was coming for many years, though he had not spoken of it. Priests did not announce such knowledge. They prepared for it privately, the way one prepares a small fire before dawn, carefully, without spectacle. As the light dimmed further, the priest stepped fully into the temple chamber. His fingers brushed the stone doorway as he passed, a gesture so small it barely registered his movement. The stone was rough beneath his skin, cool now, unyielding. It had been placed here long before his birth, and it would remain long after his name faded from memory. There was comfort in that. He settled himself near the center of the room, lowering his body with care. His knees protested briefly, then quieted. He arranged his legs beneath him, straightened his spine as much as it allowed, and rested his hands on his thighs. The position was familiar, rehearsed across decades of night vigils and early dawn ceremonies. The temple grew darker, but not empty. Darkness here was not absence, it was presence without demand. It softened edges, slowed thought, invited listening. The priest closed his eyes. Behind his lids, faint points of light appeared, not visions, not yet, but the residue of the fading sun. He did not chase them. He let them come and go, the way he had learned to let thoughts come and go. Outside, the first stars were beginning to assert themselves, one by one, in the thinning sky. They would turn overhead all night, precise and indifferent, as they always had. The priest did not need to see them to feel their movement. His body, tuned over a lifetime of watching, already knew where they were. This night would be long. It would hold memories and dreams, and the quiet voice that had walked beside him since youth. It would ask nothing of him except that he remain awake for as long as wakefulness remained. He breathed again, slow and even. The jungle listened with him. And as dusk completed its careful descent, the temple, the priest, and the turning sky settled into the shared stillness that comes only when nothing more is required. Section 2. The Path to Priesthood, Childhood, and Calling. Long before the temple stones had known the weight of his feet, before incense smoke had learned the shape of his breath, the priest had been a child who listened more than he spoke. He was born in a small settlement where the jungle loosened its grip just enough to allow maize fields to breathe. The houses there were low and practical, their walls woven from reeds and plastered with clay that cracked and healed with each season's passing. Smoke from cooking fires drifted constantly through the village, thin and familiar, carrying the scents of maize dough, crushed chilies, and damp earth. It was a place shaped by repetition rather than ambition, where days folded neatly into one another like woven mats stacked at dusk. As a boy, he had spent long hours sitting near the edge of the fields, watching the boundary where human order dissolved back into green abundance. Other children ran, shouted, tested their bodies against the limits of play. He preferred stillness. He learned early that stillness was not emptiness. It was full of insects threading invisible paths through the air, of leaves shifting with conversations too subtle to name, of distant calls that arrived softened by distance. His mother had noticed this first. She would find him sitting quietly beneath the shade of a young ceiba, his hands resting loosely in his lap, eyes focused, not on anything in particular, but on everything at once. When she asked what he was doing, he answered simply that he was listening. She accepted this answer without concern. In those days, listening was not mistaken for absence. His father worked the fields with steady patience. He spoke little but taught much through example. How to read the soil's color, how to recognize the quiet signs of approaching rain, how to move through the jungle without challenging it. From him, the boy learned respect for cycles that could not be hurried. The first jaguar entered his life not through sight, but through sound. One night, while the village slept beneath a moon softened by passing cloud, a deep call rolled through the trees beyond the fields. It was not loud, but it was complete. The sound did not ask for attention, it claimed it. The boy woke instantly, heart steady rather than frightened. He lay still, listening as the sound faded back into the dense dark. The next morning, elders spoke quietly of it. A jaguar had passed near the settlement, close enough to be heard, far enough to remain unseen. Tracks were found near the riverbank, large and deliberate, pressed deep into the mud. The boy followed the elders at a distance, studying the impressions left behind. He felt something settle inside him then, not excitement, but recognition. In the years that followed, dreams began to arrive. They were not dramatic dreams. There were no chases, no blood, no fear. Instead, there were forests without edges, shadows layered gently atop one another, and eyes watching from within the dark. Not judging, not threatening, simply present. In these dreams, the boy was never addressed directly. There were no words. Yet he always woke with the same sensation that something ancient had acknowledged him without demand. When he spoke of these dreams, he did so sparingly. Dreams were treated with care in his village, handled like fragile vessels that could spill meaning if tilted too quickly. The elders listened, exchanged glances, and nodded. No conclusions were drawn aloud, but attention gathered around the boy like quiet water. It was during his 12th year that the calling became unavoidable. A traveling priest arrived from the larger city to the east, following the calendar's requirements for seasonal rites. He was older, his hair bound tightly, his movements precise and economical. When he spoke, others fell silent, not because of volume, but because of certainty. He noticed the boy immediately, noticed the way he watched the smoke rise during offerings, noticed how his gaze tracked the sun's descent without conscious effort, noticed how, when the ritual drums paused, the boy remained still, listening into the silence rather than filling it. After the ceremony, the priest spoke privately with the elders. No one heard the words, but the outcome became clear within days. The boy would be sent to the temple complex when the rains ended, to begin formal training. The night before his departure, his mother sat with him outside their home. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, and frogs had begun their layered chorus. She did not cry. She traced symbols into the dust with her fingers, protective shapes taught to her by her own mother, and placed her palm briefly against his chest. "Listen well," she told him. It was both advice and blessing. The journey to the temple city took several days. They traveled by foot and canoe, moving through regions where the jungle grew taller, denser, more deliberate. Stone structures rose gradually from the green, first as scattered platforms, then as full pyramids stepping upward toward the sky. The boy felt no fear at their approach, only a deepening quiet. Training was slow. The novice priests were taught to sweep before they were taught to speak sacred words. They learned the names of stars before they learned the names of gods. They memorized the calendars not as numbers, but as rhythms, cycles that could be felt in the body if attended to long enough. At night, the boy dreamed less often, or perhaps he dreamed the same dreams so consistently that they no longer announced themselves. The jaguar did not always appear, but its presence lingered at the edges of his awareness, like a shadow that moved when he did. Years passed in study and repetition. His body grew lean and strong, shaped by kneeling, fasting, and long hours of observation. His voice deepened, but he used it rarely. Silence became his preferred teacher. One night, during a solitary vigil, the jaguar finally spoke. Not in words, but in understanding. The boy, no longer truly a boy, sat alone within an inner chamber. The stone cooled beneath him. Smoke curled upward, and his breath followed it. In the darkness behind his closed eyes, the jaguar emerged, fully formed and unafraid of being seen. It did not approach. It did not retreat. It simply was. In that stillness, the novice understood what his life would require of him. Patience without passivity, strength without display, and listening without expectation of reply. When dawn arrived, pale and quiet, he rose and returned to his duties without comment. There was no need to speak of what had been given. The path had opened. He would walk it for the rest of his life. Section 3. The Living Jungle. Animals, plants, and sacred balance. The jungle was never a place the priest believed he understood. Even after decades of walking its paths, memorizing its seasons, and listening to its countless voices, he did not speak of mastery. Mastery suggested dominance, and dominance implied resistance. The jungle offered neither. It existed in a state of continuous agreement with itself, an agreement older than names and untroubled by explanation. From his earliest years of training, he had been taught that the jungle was not a background against which human life unfolded. It was not scenery, it was not resource, it was present, active, attentive, and responsive. To move through it required the same care one would bring into a ceremonial chamber. Every step was an interaction. As a young priest, he had been sent often beyond the temple walls, not to conquer distance, but to observe it. These journeys were quiet affairs, undertaken alone or with a single elder who spoke only when necessary. They would rise before first light when the jungle still held the cool breath of night, and walk slowly into the green density as mist lifted from the ground like a second sky. The priest learned to recognize the jungle's many tempos. There was the rapid urgency of ants repairing a broken trail, each movement precise and collective. There was the patient stillness of the boa, coiled and waiting without tension. There was the casual authority of the howler monkey's call, thrown across vast distances not to threaten, but to announce continued existence. Each creature moved according to its own understand of time. The jaguar, however, moved according to none of these. It was not the fastest, nor the largest, nor the loudest. Its power lay in its restraint. The priest had seen jaguars only a handful of times in his life, always briefly, always at a distance that felt deliberate. A flash of patterned muscle slipping between shadows, a pause at the edge of vision. Once, only once, a full form revealed beneath moonlight, still, watching, then gone. From the elders, he learned that the jaguar did not rule the jungle through force. It ruled through balance. It culled without cruelty, moved without waste. took only what was needed. Where the jaguar walked, the forest adjusted itself quietly, maintaining the delicate proportions that allowed everything else to continue. In this way, the jaguar became more than animal, it became principle. Plants, too, spoke their own languages. The priest learned to identify leaves by touch alone, running his fingers along their edges in darkness. Serrated or smooth, thick or fragile. He learned which roots cooled fevers and which induced visions, which bark soothed inflammation, which flowers opened only at night, releasing their fragrance when the air was most receptive. Copal resin was among the first offerings he memorized, not just in name, but in behavior. He learned how it softened under heat, how it resisted flame just long enough to produce smoke without being consumed. Smoke was transformation, made visible, solid to vapor, substance to signal. Cacao held a different role. It was nourishment, yes, but also bridge. Prepared carefully, mixed with water and spice, it opened the body gently, encouraging attention rather than intoxication. During long vigils, cacao sustained wakefulness without agitation, grounding the mind while allowing it to drift. Maize, always maize, anchored everything. The priest had been taught that humans were not merely dependent upon maize, they were shaped by it. Its cycles mirrored their own: planting, growth, harvest, rest. To honor maize was to honor continuity. He remembered a season of drought during his early adulthood, when the rains hesitated beyond expectation. The fields yellowed, the air thickened with concern. The priest did not rush to call down rain through grand ritual. Instead, he walked the jungle's edge daily, observing. He watched how certain plants conserved moisture. He watched how animals shifted their routines. He listened for changes in insect patterns. Only when the jungle itself indicated readiness did the ritual take place. The rains came not immediately, but appropriately. No one celebrated loudly. Relief arrived quietly, as it always did. Balance was not something to be demanded, it was something to be maintained. This understanding shaped the priest's approach to all things, including his own body. Fasting was practiced not as punishment, but as recalibration. Silence was observed not as deprivation, but as refinement. Even pain was acknowledged as information rather than enemy. At night, within the temple, these lessons returned to him through memory rather than instruction. He would sit beneath the carved stone ceiling and recall the feel of wet leaves brushing his ankles, the way certain birds fell silent at dusk while others took their place, the subtle shift in air pressure that preceded rain. The jungle did not separate the sacred from the ordinary. Eating was sacred, walking was sacred, listening was sacred. The priest often reflected that if the gods had chosen to reside anywhere, it was not in stone structures or ritual objects, but in the relationships between living things. The temple served as a point of focus, a place where attention could be gathered and directed. But the jungle was the true sanctuary. Even now, on his final night, seated within ancient stone, the jungle remained present. Its sounds threaded through the temple walls, softened unmistakable. Frogs called in layered patterns, insects traced steady rhythms, leaves shifted, responding to movements unseen. He inhaled, and the scent of green life reached him even here. In his mind's quiet center, the jaguar stirred not as image, not as voice, but as alignment, a reminder that stillness was not stagnation and silence was not absence. The jungle continued its work, and the priest, shaped by years of listening, remained part of its balance. Section 4. Rituals remembered. Blood, smoke, and song. Ritual, to the priest, had never been performance. From the outside, those who visited the great cities for the first time sometimes mistook ceremony for display. They saw the painted bodies, the measured steps, the offerings arranged with exact symmetry. They heard the drums, felt the vibration in their chests, and assumed the purpose was to impress gods or people, or both. But from within the circle of practice, ritual felt very different. It felt like maintenance. As one tended a roof before the rains or cleared channels before planting, so ritual tended the unseen structures that held the world in balance. It was careful work, quiet work, often repetitive, sometimes exhausting, and always necessary. The priest learned this early in his ceremonial life. His first responsibilities were small. He carried water, he prepared pigments, he counted breaths while elders chanted. Each task was performed with attention because attention itself was the offering. Blood, when it appeared, was never treated lightly. He remembered the first time he witnessed bloodletting not as spectacle, but as stillness. The chamber had been silent except for breathing. The elder priest had moved slowly, deliberately, using a stingray spine polished smooth by generations of hands. There was no rush. Pain was acknowledged and not emphasized. Blood was not sacrifice in the sense of loss. It was communication. Blood carried memory. Blood carried lineage. Blood carried promise. The young priest had watched as drops fell onto bark paper, darkening it, marking it with a language older than words. The paper was later burned, its smoke rising as signal rather than offering. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was done for excess. As years passed, the priest himself took on these rites. Age did not make them easier, but it made them steadier. He learned how to prepare the body beforehand, fasting, breathing, stilling the mind so that the body followed. The pain, when it came, arrived cleanly, without struggle. Afterwards, there was always rest. Balance was restored. Smoke was constant companion to all ceremony. Copal, burning slowly, created a bridge between states. The priest learned to read smoke the way others read clouds. A thin, steady column suggested clarity. Smoke that drifted erratically signaled distraction. When the smoke curled back toward the ground, it was taken as a sign to pause, to realign. Song carried the calendar forward. Chants were not composed for beauty. They were shaped for function. Their rhythms aligned with breath. Their tones resonated with stone chambers, vibrating through walls built precisely for this purpose. Over time, the priest came to know each chant not as a sequence of sounds, but as a movement, an internal journey that began in the chest and ended somewhere beyond hearing. He remembered one ceremony in particular, performed at the close of a long cycle. The city had gathered before dawn, bodies wrapped in simple cloth, faces calm. No one spoke. The drums began slowly, spaced widely apart. Between each beat, silence stretched long enough for thoughts to settle. As the chant rose, the priest felt the familiar narrowing of awareness, not a loss, but a focusing. The edges of the world softened, breath deepened. The presence he had known since youth, the Jaguar, what the Jaguar represented, aligned itself quietly beside him. There was no vision. There was no voice. Only correctness. Ritual did not bring revelation so much as confirmation. It confirmed that the world still held together, that the agreements between sky, earth, and people remained intact. When the ceremony ended, there was no applause, no release of tension. People simply dispersed, returning to their homes, their fields, their ordinary tasks. The extraordinary had served its purpose by preserving the ordinary. As the priest aged, his role shifted. He performed fewer rites requiring physical endurance and more that required precision of memory. He taught novices how to prepare spaces, how to move without disturbance, how to listen for when a ritual should end rather than insisting it continue. One of the hardest lessons to pass on was restraint. Young priests often believed devotion meant intensity, long fasts, elaborate gestures, loud invocation. The priest taught them otherwise. He taught them that excess weakened signal, that the gods, if they listened at all, listened for clarity, not volume. He recalled guiding one novice through his first major rite. The young man's hands trembled, his breathing shallow. The priest placed a steady hand on his shoulder and said nothing. Words were unnecessary. The presence was enough. The rite proceeded without error. Later, alone, the priest reflected that this quiet guidance was the true legacy of ritual practice, not the acts themselves, but the way they shaped attention. Now, seated within the temple on his final night, he felt those countless ceremonies settle around him like layers of woven cloth. Each ritual had left its trace, not as burden, but as structure. His body remembered movements his mind no longer needed to direct. The air still carried the faint scent of copal. Somewhere beyond the walls, the jungle breathed. He inhaled, exhaled, and allowed memory to pass through him without attachment. Ritual, after all, was never about holding on. It was about letting the world continue. Section 5. The Jaguar Spirit. First voice in the dark. The Jaguar did not arrive with ceremony. It never had. In the priest's memory, its presence was always marked by a deepening rather than a disruption. Sounds did not cease when it came, they aligned. Shadows did not scatter, they settled into clearer shapes. The air itself seemed to pause not in anticipation but in recognition. The first true dialogue had occurred many years after the initial dreams of youth, long after training had shaped the priest's posture and breath into ritual readiness. It came during a night vigil undertaken alone, as so many were, when the temple was emptied of others and the city slept beneath a cloudless sky. He had been seated within the inner chamber for hours, his body folded neatly, his mind resting lightly against the rhythm of breath. The incense had burned low. Smoke lingered only as a faint trace, a memory of movement rather than movement itself. At some point, without clear transition, the darkness behind his closed eyes shifted. This was not unusual. The mind, when left undisturbed, rearranged itself. Patterns emerged and dissolved. Light appeared where there was none. The priest observed these changes without interest, as he had been taught. Attention without attachment was the discipline. Yet this shift carried weight. The darkness grew dense, not heavy, but intentional. It gathered itself the way water gathers in a still pool. Within it, a form suggested itself, not immediately whole, not imposed upon the senses, but allowed to be noticed. The jaguar stood at the edge of perception. It did not face him. It did not approach. It existed in perfect balance between concealment and revelation. The priest felt no fear. Fear required urgency, and nothing here was urgent. His breathing remained slow, his body untroubled. If anything, a sense of familiarity settled over him, as though he had entered a room he had known since childhood and had not visited in many years. When understand came, it did so without language. There were no questions asked. There were no answers given. Instead, a simple exchange occurred, attention meeting attention. The jaguar's presence pressed lightly against the edges of the priest's awareness, not to test, not to instruct, but to confirm alignment. In that moment, the priest understood that the jaguar was not a guide in the way elders guided novices. It did not lead forward. It did not point out paths. It reflected. What the priest brought into the silence determined what the jaguar returned. On nights when his mind carried distraction, the jaguar remained distant, its outline indistinct. On nights when his attention was clear, it stood fully present, unadorned and complete. This realization reshaped the priest's inner life. He stopped seeking meaning in encounters. He stopped interpreting symbols. Instead, he focused on preparation, on keeping his inner space orderly, receptive, free of unnecessary clutter. The jaguar required no devotion, only honesty. Over the years, their silent exchanges continued. Sometimes they took place within the temple. Other times they arose while the priest walked alone through the jungle at night, guided by memory rather than sight. The jaguar never appeared in full physical form during these moments. It did not need to. Its presence was felt in posture, in breath, in the way the priest placed his feet upon the earth. Once, during a particularly long dry season, the priest had struggled with doubt. Not doubt of the gods, but of his own effectiveness. Rituals had been performed correctly. Offerings had been made, yet the rains delayed. That night, the jaguar came closer than ever before. In the inner darkness, it turned its head. For the first time, the priest met its gaze. The eyes were not fierce. They were calm, unconcerned. They reflected nothing except the priest himself, as he was in that moment tense, expectant, holding too tightly to outcome. The understand that followed was gentle but unmistakable. Balance could not be forced. Attention could not be hurried. The priest released his concern. The rains came days later, without ceremony. From then on, the jaguar's presence became less frequent but more precise. It appeared only when necessary, when alignment wavered or clarity sharpened beyond habit. Now, on this final night, seated within the familiar stone chamber, the priest sensed the jaguar again. Not as vision, not yet, but as readiness. It waited. Not for him to act, but for him to be. The stars continued their slow turning overhead. The jungle breathed. And within the deep stillness of the temple, the jaguar spirit remained silent, reflective, and complete. Section 6. Love, Loss, and the Lives He Did Not Live. As the night deepened and the air within the temple cooled, The priest felt his thoughts drift toward those regions of memory he had visited least often. Ritual memories came easily. So did lessons, calendars, and the measured movements of ceremony. These had been rehearsed until they rested lightly within him, requiring no effort to recall. But memories of love, of attachment not sanctioned by duty, were quieter. They surfaced only when the world grew still enough to receive them. The priest had not lived a life without affection. This was a common misunderstanding, one often held by those who imagined devotion as denial. In truth, affection had surrounded him from childhood onward. Family, teachers, fellow priests, villagers whose births and deaths he had witnessed, all of these had shaped him. But love of another kind had been asked of him as well, and it was this request that marked the shape of the life he did not live. There had been a woman, her name no longer arrived fully formed. Names, like faces, softened over time, their edges worn smooth by memories passing. What remained was not the sound of her name, but the sensation of her presence, steady, attentive, unhurried. She had lived near the temple complex, part of a family tasked with maintaining the outer courtyard. They had spoken first in passing, exchanging practical observations about weather and work. Over time, these exchanges lengthened. They discovered a shared preference for quiet, for standing side by side without the need to fill space with words. The priest was young then, newly initiated, still adjusting to the weight of expectation placed upon him. He did not seek attachment, but neither did he resist the ease that developed between them. They spoke of ordinary things, of the way the light changed along the stone walls at dusk, of how certain birds returned each year without fail, of the comfort found in routines repeated gently. There was no dramatic moment when he chose duty over companionship. There was no declaration, no rupture. Instead, the path narrowed gradually, the way jungle trails do. One day, without clear acknowledgement, the possibility simply lay behind him. He had felt the loss then not as pain, but as absence. Absence had a texture of its own. He carried that texture with him into his work, into his rituals, into the long nights of vigil. It did not distract him. If anything, it refined his attention. Love unrealized sharpened awareness of other bonds. There were friendships as well, deep, enduring, shaped by shared silence rather than shared speech. Fellow priests with whom he spent years studying the skies, counting days, maintaining balance. Some of them grew old alongside him. Others departed earlier, claimed by illness, accident, or the slow erosion of time. He remembered one elder in particular, a teacher whose voice had been barely louder than breath. From him, the priest learned the value of restraint. The elder would pause often mid-sentence, allowing silence to complete the thought. When he passed, there was no ceremony beyond the necessary rites. His absence was marked instead by the way silence seemed to deepen within the temple chambers. Loss, the priest learned, did not announce itself. It arrived quietly. It settled, and then it stayed. Over the years, he officiated countless departures, rituals for the dead, words spoken carefully into the air, offerings placed with precision. Yet none of these rites removed grief. They simply gave it structure. Grief, like all things, required form if it was to be carried without harm. As he aged, the priest noticed how the lives around him branched outward in directions his own did not. Children grew into adults, families expanded, stories multiplied. He remained constant, a fixed point within a shifting pattern. There were moments, usually brief and uninvited, when he wondered who he might have been otherwise. Would he have walked the jungle paths with a companion at his side? Would he have taught his knowledge to a child bearing his features? Would his nights have been filled with shared warmth rather than solitary stillness? These questions never lingered. They arrived, were acknowledged, and passed on. Regret, when it appeared, was gentle. It carried no bitterness. The priest understood that every life was defined as much by what it did not contain as by what it did. The Jaguar never commented on these reflections. It did not appear during moments of longing. It arrived only when alignment wavered, not when the heart softened. The priest took comfort in this distinction. It reminded him that longing was not imbalance. It was simply another aspect of being human. Now, seated within the temple on his final night, these memories surfaced without resistance. He allowed them space. breathing slowly as images formed and dissolved. He felt gratitude rather than sorrow. Gratitude for having known affection in its many forms. Gratitude for having carried loss without being diminished by it. Gratitude for the quiet integrity of a life lived attentively, even when certain doors remained unopened. The night continued its steady passage. Outside, the jungle adjusted its rhythms. Inside, the priest rested within the fullness of what had been and what had not. Section 7. War, Change, and the Fragility of Cities. The priest had lived long enough to know that stillness did not mean permanence. Even the most carefully balanced systems shifted. Even the most enduring cities carried within them the certainty of change. This understanding had come to him not through catastrophe, but through observation, through the slow accumulation of small alterations that, over time, reshaped everything. In his youth, the city surrounding the temple had been full. Voices echoed along the stone causeways at all hours. Markets overflowed with maize, woven cloth, obsidian blades, cacao beans counted carefully by practiced hands. Messengers arrived daily, bearing news from neighboring cities, each one folded into the greater rhythm of exchange and diplomacy. The priest remembered standing atop the temple steps at dawn, watching smoke rise from countless hearths. It had felt then as though the city breathed as a single body, each household a lung contributing to the whole. But bodies age. The first signs of change were subtle. A market day quieter than expected. A family relocating east, following rumors of better soil. A messenger who did not return. No ritual announced these shifts. They were not interpreted as omens. They were simply noted, recorded quietly in memory. There had been conflicts, of course. Disagreements between cities over water rights, trade routes, or honor. The priest had witnessed preparations for war without ever lifting a weapon himself. His role was not to command or to fight, but to observe, to maintain ritual continuity even as uncertainty pressed in from the edges. He remembered one such season clearly. Drums sounded more frequently then, not for ceremony, but for signaling. Warriors moved through the city, their bodies marked with paint that carried both protection and intention. There was tension in the air, but not chaos. Even war among his people was shaped by rules and restraint. Before the warriors departed, the priest performed the necessary rites. He did not promise victory. That was never within his authority. Instead, he invoked clarity of purpose and acceptance of outcome. To walk into conflict without illusion was considered the highest preparation. Many returned. Some did not. The city absorbed these absences quietly. Names were spoken, offerings made, spaces left unfilled. Life continued, altered but intact. What troubled the priest more than conflict was neglect. As years passed, certain structures fell into disrepair. Stone steps cracked and were not replaced. Reservoirs filled more slowly. Ritual attendance thinned, not from disbelief, but from distance, physical and emotional. People traveled farther, stayed longer away. The web of daily interaction stretched thinner. The priest did not interpret this as moral failure. Civilizations, he understood, were not punished for imbalance. They simply responded to it. Droughts lengthened, rain patterns shifted. Fields demanded more labor for less yield. Families made practical choices. Survival, like ritual, required adaptation. There were moments when the priest wondered whether the gods were withdrawing. But these thoughts passed. The gods had never been stationary. They moved with cycles, with attention, with relevance. If a city lost its ability to listen to the land, to the sky, to itself, then the conversation naturally shifted elsewhere. He remembered walking through an outer district one evening, long after many families had departed. Vines had begun reclaiming stone walls, roots pressed gently into cracks. The jungle did not hurry its return. It never did. Watch this, the priest felt no grief, only recognition. Cities, like people, had lifespans. They rose, held meaning, and eventually released their form back into the larger world. Nothing truly vanished. It only changed state. Throughout these transitions, the priest remained. Not because he resisted change, but because his role was anchored to place. As long as the temple stood and the calendar turned, someone must listen, must mark the passage of time with care. He outlived many of those who once stood beside him. New priests arrived, trained, and sometimes departed again, carrying knowledge to other centers. The priest became a quiet constant, a reference point rather than an authority. Now, on this final night, he reflected on these changes without attachment. The city beyond the temple walls was quieter than it had once been. Some structures lay abandoned, others still held life. The balance had shifted, but it had not broken. Outside, the jungle waited patiently. It always did. The priest inhaled slowly, feeling the weight of centuries settle into something manageable, something light enough to carry into silence. Change was not an ending. It was a return. Section 8. The Turning Sky. Stargazing in Cosmic Order. As the night reached its deepest hours, the priest shifted his awareness upward. He did not move from his place on the stone floor. His body remained settled, joints aligned as comfortably as age allowed. But attention, long practiced in travel without motion, rose through the temple ceiling and into the open sky beyond. The stars were clear tonight. They often were this far from the coast, where the air thinned gently after sunset and held steady through the night. Clouds passed when they wished, not when summoned. Tonight, they had chosen absence. The priest had learned the sky as one learns a familiar landscape, not by memorizing isolated points, but by understand relationships. Each star mattered less on its own than in its movement with others. Patterns were not fixed images, but living arrangements, shifting slowly with the seasons, the years, the generations. As a novice, he had spent countless nights lying on cool stone terraces, guided by elders who spoke softly and pointed sparingly. They taught him not to name too quickly. First came observation. Only after long familiarity were names allowed to settle. He learned the slow path of the sun, its predictable rise and descent, its steady migration along the horizon throughout the year. He learned how shadows lengthened and shortened, how stone markers aligned briefly and precisely on certain days, signaling transitions too subtle for the untrained eye. Venus demanded particular attention. The priest remembered the patience required to truly understand its cycle. It was not content to remain either morning or evening star. It disappeared, returned, reversed itself. Many novices grew frustrated with its refusal to conform to simple expectation. But patience revealed order. Venus taught the priest that absence was not disappearance, it was transformation. The calendars were built upon such understand. They were not merely tools for counting days, they were frameworks for meaning, ways of situating human activity within a vast, repeating order. Each cycle closed not with finality, but with invitation. Now on this final night, the priest traced those cycles inwardly. He felt where the sun rested beneath the earth, imagined its steady travel through unseen regions. He sensed Venus holding its position beyond sight, preparing for its next return. The stars turned. They always did. This motion comforted him. It required nothing of him. It did not pause for his awareness, nor did it accelerate. The sky offered continuity without demand. At some point, the priest opened his eyes. The temple chamber was dark, but not opaque. Through the doorway, a portion of the sky revealed itself, deep, layered, scattered with light. He did not count the stars. Counting was unnecessary now. He simply allowed their presence to settle into him. He reflected on how much of his life had been spent in relation to this sky. Rituals timed to solstices, offerings aligned with eclipses, teachings passed down through careful observation rather than a searching. The sky had never belonged to the gods alone. It belonged equally to farmers watching for rain, travelers marking direction, children learning wonder for the first time. In this shared attention, the priest found one of the truest forms of unity. No hierarchy existed beneath the stars. All stood equally small, equally included. The Jaguar stirred again at the edge of his awareness. Not as image, not as voice, but as alignment with the sky's quiet authority. The Jaguar, too, moved by stars. It hunted by moonlight. It rested according to rhythms older than temples. In this understand, the priest felt his own place clarified not above, not below, but within. Time, he knew, would continue without him. The calendars would still turn. The stars would still trace their paths. Others would look up and feel the same calm recognition. This knowledge brought no sadness, only relief. The priest's breathing slowed further, matching the night's deep stillness. His thoughts loosened their structure, drifting toward images less bound by chronology. Dreams waited nearby. The sky continued its patient turning. Section 9. Dreams before dawn. The Jaguar walks once more. The boundary between waking and sleep did not arrive suddenly. It softened. Thought loosened its hold, releasing images not in sequence, but in rhythm. The priest remained seated, his body still upright, yet awareness drifted gently inward, as though the mind were stepping back into a familiar forest path it had walked many times before. Breath continued on its own. In, out. The temple did not disappear, but it thinned, becoming less solid, less defined. Stone walls gave way to suggestion. Darkness deepened, not as absence, but as invitation. And then, without effort, the jungle appeared. It was not the jungle of any single place or time. It was assembled from memory and meaning, from nights walked alone and mornings scented with rain. Leaves layered themselves into endless depth. The ground was soft beneath unseen feet. The air held the quiet expectancy that belonged only to moments before dawn. The priest did not question where he was. He understood that questions belonged to waking. Ahead, a presence moved. The Jaguar did not emerge out at once. First came the sense of weight shifting through foliage, a subtle displacement of space. Then the suggestion of form, muscle flowing beneath patterned skin, movement controlled and exact. It walked without sound. It did not turn to look at him. Still, the priest followed. There was no urgency in their movement. Each step unfolded naturally from the last. The path did not resist them. Branches parted. Roots made room. The jungle recognized the Jaguar and accepted the priest by extension. As they walked, scenes formed and dissolved around them. A child seated beneath a ceiba tree, listening. A novice sweeping stone floors before sunrise. Hands arranging offerings with careful symmetry. None of these images demanded attention. They arose, lingered briefly, and faded, like reflections on slow-moving water. The Jaguar led him onward. At times, the jungle thinned, revealing stone structures half reclaimed by vines. Temple steps softened by moss, carvings blurred by time. The priest felt no loss at their sight, only continuity. Stone returned to earth, earth reshaped stone. Eventually, the forest opened into a wide clearing. Above it, the sky stretched vast and deep, stars still visible, though their brightness had begun to soften. Dawn approached, not yet present, but inevitable. The Jaguar stopped. For the first time in this dream, it turned fully toward him. The priest met its gaze without hesitation. There was no judgment there, no command, only completion. Understanding passed between them, not as message, but as shared stillness. The priest felt the long arc of his life settle into coherence. Nothing was missing. Nothing required amendment. The Jaguar lowered itself to the ground. It rested. The priest understood this as invitation rather than instruction. He too allowed himself to rest, not by lying down, but by releasing the last traces of effort he had carried for so long. The clearing brightened imperceptibly. Stars withdrew one by one, not vanishing, but yielding to the coming light. The sky shifted from deep indigo toward softer hues, layered gently rather than abruptly. The Jaguar began to fade, not retreating, not dissolving, but becoming unnecessary. Its presence, once distinct, now diffused throughout the landscape. It was in the trees, the ground, the open sky. It was in him. The priest felt no separation. The dream thinned, just as waking had thinned before it. Stone returned. Cool air brushed his skin. The scent of earth and smoke reached him once more. Somewhere, a bird called, single, clear, unhurried. The priest remained still, eyes closed, breath shallow and calm. Dawn waited just beyond the temple walls. Section 10. Final breath at first light. Dawn arrived without ceremony. It always did. The first light did not rush into the jungle or announce itself with color. It seeped slowly into the spaces that had been prepared for it all night long. Darkness did not resist. It loosened, retreated, and made room. Within the temple, the priest remained seated as he had been for many hours. His posture had softened during the night. his spine no longer held with effort but supported by familiarity. His hands rested loosely in his lap. Breath moved shallowly, steadily, like water barely disturbing its surface. Outside, the jungle adjusted once more. Night insects quieted one by one, their work complete. Birds began to test the air with short, tentative calls, listening for response. Somewhere in the distance, leaves shifted as an unseen animal moved toward water. The temple stones cooled further as the warmth of day had not yet returned. Moisture gathered along their edges, darkening surfaces already worn smooth by centuries of touch and weather. Moss glistened faintly where the new light reached it. The priest opened his eyes. For a moment there was no thought attached to the action. Vision returned gently, as if invited rather than claimed. He looked toward the doorway and saw the sky transformed, not bright yet, but pale, layered with soft color that carried no urgency. This was the hour he had greeted more times than he could count, the hour of closing, the hour of beginning. He felt no need to mark it with ritual. The night itself had been sufficient. Everything that required attention had already received it. Breath entered his body and left again, each cycle slightly longer than the last. There was no discomfort, no struggle, only a gradual easing, as though the boundary between breath and air were becoming less distinct. The priest's thoughts did not gather into memory now. They thinned. Images loosened their edges and drifted away. Words lost relevance. What remained was sensation, cool stone beneath skin, faint warmth along his face. The distant sound of life continuing beyond the temple walls. The jaguar did not appear. It did not need to. Its presence had already completed its work. Alignment had been achieved. Nothing further was required. The priest inhaled, exhaled, and in the gentle space that followed, breath did not return. There was no moment that demanded attention, no final realization. Awareness did not collapse, it simply spread, thinning until it was indistinguishable from the stillness around it. Outside, dawn continued, birdsong strengthened. Light reached deeper into the jungle, illuminating leaves, bark, and stone without preference. A breeze moved through the canopy, stirring the air within the temple briefly before passing on. The priest remained seated, unmoving, his body now fully at rest against the ancient floor. He did not appear different from moments before. Peace does not announce itself. Time moved forward. The calendars would turn. Other hands would tend the temple, for as long as tending was needed. And when stone finally yielded to root and rain, the jungle would receive it without judgment. Somewhere beyond sight, a jaguar walked its path. It did not look back. It did not need to. The world continued, balanced and attentive, as it always had. This is the end of the story. Let me know what you think about it. I also really appreciate if you like and subscribe to my channel. Until the next one.